Hello, everyone. Good morning. Good afternoon, or good evening, depending on when you hear this episode. But welcome. My name is Jose Richard Aviles with the Othering and Belonging Institute. And welcome to the launch of Real Solutions, a podcast series about policies for a future where everyone belongs. We are launching this series with this live event. Joining us are 10 organizations who are co-sponsoring this series. And this conversation will also be the first podcast episode. Eli, good morning. How are you doing?
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm fired up and ready to go. Hi, everyone. I'm a co-host, Eli Moore with the Othering and Belonging Institute. Excited for this conversation today. So there are a lot of false solutions being peddled these days. They say your rent is too high, so government should deport immigrants, or your wages aren't enough, then billionaires should get lower taxes. You're worried about your kid's future, then trans kids should lose their rights. These are real problems, but false solutions. Real problems deserve real solutions. So that's what we're here to talk about.
Yes, and so at the Othering and Belonging Institute, we're co-hosting this podcast series with leaders from across the country to uplift and insist on bold policy solutions that move the country towards belonging and well-being for all people.
And the solutions we cover in this series are not all the solutions needed. They're not the end-all be-all, but we see them as a starting point for conversations about how we build a bold collective policy agenda. And in these first set of episodes, we focus on policies that we see doing at least three things. One, setting an example for how we can build new systems and structures for belonging. In a moment when public institutions are being dismantled, we need to not just be ready to rebuild what was lost, but instead create something much better. Secondly, addressing our basic needs as humans. We have to start with issues most deeply and broadly felt in our day-to-day lives, like housing, economic security, safety. And then lastly, building and shifting power to include all people.
And so this launch event is a chance for us to start a conversation across organizations about real solutions, why they're needed, what they are, and how we can advance them. We're excited to partner on this series with 10 leaders from incredible organizations spanning labor, media, community, policy, and government. And before we hear from our speakers, quick shout out to all the folks who are joining us on YouTube and LinkedIn, and soon enough on Spotify and Apple Podcasts and everywhere else you get your podcasts. Today, we're going to hear from Christina Livingston from the Alliance of Californians for Community Empowerment, Gordon Marn from the National Union of Healthcare Workers, Ivan Luevanos-Elms from Local Progress, Irene from Courage California, Lucas Grindley from Next City, Rithika Ramamurthy from Climate and Community Institute, Sara Hudson from Nonprofit Quarterly, Saqib Bhatti, Action Center on Race and Economy, Tony Samara, Right to the City, and Zach Liu from California Green New Deal Coalition. Now, that is a lot of folks with a lot of things and a lot of policies we're going to talk about. So you may be wondering, how is this going to even work today? So we're going to have three parts to this conversation. And in each part, you will hear from 3 to 4 speakers for a few minutes each. Then we'll open up a free-flowing conversation among all the speakers. And with that, let's get started. And Eli, take it away with that first question.
All right. So if we could bring on Tony from Right to the City, and Saqib and Ivan. And we wanted to kick off this first conversation thinking about why is it important to focus on real solutions in this moment of such dramatic attacks on communities and on public institutions. Why not just focus on defense? What's the power of putting forward real solutions, even when it may feel impossible to achieve them? I'll pass it to you, Tony.
All right. Thank you, Eli. Thank you, Jose. And thank you to Othering and Belonging for convening us today. So I guess let me start by trying to situate us a bit, right? We have a big conversation that's about to unfold. So I guess first I would say I think we are in a moment of populist politics right here around the globe, whether we think that's a good thing or not, but this is a populist moment. And just to keep it simple, by that I just mean that we're in a time when politics is defined by alliances across class instead of around class, and mainly across the middle and working classes. And as is always the case with populism, the subject of this politics is the people, however that gets defined. And that struggle over who is the people is a big part of the populist moments, right? So when the right talks about the people, it's very clear who they mean. They have explicitly sought to win over the people primarily around very specific cultural issues and to build power through an appeal to racial nationalism. And that combination has been very successful for them, and it feels familiar to us. And so we notice that even when they talk about economic issues, it's often through the lenses of culture and racial nationalism, right? So on housing, before the election, housing is an issue that we Right to the City work on. Their discourse on housing was aimed at building a consensus around xenophobia, not around helping renters, right? So it sought to blame immigrants for the housing crisis rather than to talk about the contradictions of a for-profit housing market that hurts renters of all races and ethnicities. And on this terrain, the terrain of populism, liberals, progressives, the left, we've really struggled to find something that appeals to people, to the people in the same way. But we are in a moment of political opportunity. Everything is up for grabs, it feels like. So that's why I think defense is not enough. And I think there are two aspects to this. One, because defense alone will not push real solutions into the public sphere in front of the people. This is a moment, as I said, when there's an openness to real solutions. And I think it would be a political catastrophe for us, for progressives, the left, not to step into this moment and use what little power we have to put real solutions in front of the public and to contrast those with the false solutions that right-wing populism or centrist neoliberalism are pushing. And then second, I think defense alone risks reinforcing institutions and practices that are part of the problem, right? So voting is under attack, so we want to defend voting and voting rights. But we know those have been insufficient, and that insufficiency has contributed to the populism that the right is now manipulating. Science is under attack, so we want to defend it. But we know the many ways science has failed to serve us, for example, in the capture of so much scientific research by the market. And here's the big one. The right has been in overdrive trying to frame the broad united front from centrist Democrats to the left as anti-American. So we are defending our patriotism, even though patriotism and nationalism have so often been used against us, right? So for example, no kings this weekend, American flags everywhere. That's complicated because the flag has historically been a very complicated symbol for many of our communities and certainly globally. So just to restate the point, uncritically defending voting, science, patriotism risks ignoring the weaknesses of these institutions that we've been talking about for decades. And yet, I would argue at some level, we have to defend them and we have to learn to fight offensively as well. So that's, again, defense is not enough. We have to learn to fight offensively on terrain that's either unfamiliar to us or that we've traditionally seen as hostile terrain. So let me end with 3 points. One, we have to engage on this terrain if we're going to get real solutions in front of the people. The right has been very effective at taking the fight to us, and we need to learn how to do the same. So yes, defend ourselves, but also go on the offense. Two, going into new or unfamiliar terrain can't just be when we have a campaign. It has to be holistic and an aspect of all our work all the time. And finally, we have to see gaining and keeping political territory as a central, if not the central task of the moment. That's also how we're going to win the actual policies we want to win. But this fight, as we all know, is much bigger than policy. And with that, Eli, I'll turn it back to you and Jose.
Thanks, Tony. On to you, Saqib.
Great. It's great to be here. And I have to say, I really regret not going before Tony because I feel like he said everything I wanted to say, but more eloquently. I mean, yeah, just agreeing with Tony, like I think we have to go on offense so that we can win the real solutions that our communities need, right? Because when you're on defense, the best you can hope for is to stop things from getting worse. You can't make them better. And so that means that defense is actually you're defending the status quo. We know the status quo does not work for our communities. As Tony said, it really is the reason why people are really sort of, there's an increase in right-wing populism is because we're seeing the right offer change, and folks from the Democratic Party really offering the status quo and saying, hey, look, things are already good, when people know in their gut that they're not good, that they're not right. And so if we want to be able to actually advance, to be able to make the changes that our communities need, we must put forth real solutions, and we must develop plans to actually win them, right? So for me, when I think about what does it mean to go on offense, I think we have to expose who is harming our communities and how they're using divide and conquer tactics to do it. Right? We know right now that there's a group of billionaire oligarchs hailing from the tech sector, right down the street from you all at the Othering and Belonging Institute, that are really driving a lot of the big policies. We're seeing the attacks on immigrants, the attacks on the social safety net, the attacks on the civil service. All of these things we know are going to have a really, really harmful effect on all of our communities, but also, and when I say all of our communities, like poor Black and brown communities, but also poor white communities in red states. Everyone's going to be hurt by what these billionaires are pushing. So how do we expose them and really make Trump choose a side? Is he actually for the people he claims to represent, or is he actually for those billionaires? And of course, we know the answer. And so what we need to do is expose them and then run campaigns to make them toxic, to actually chip away at their power, so that we can actually win the solutions we need. The other side, they've done a very good job keeping us on defense. They try to overwhelm us with these relentless attacks, so we barely have room to breathe, because we have to stop those bad things from happening. But it's important to know that to remember that the best defense is offense. And so we have to go on offense because our communities are really counting on us too.
Thank you, Saqib. Ivan.
Well, I'm lucky to follow Saqib and Tony, because they basically said a lot of the things, and now I can focus on the other things. So buenos dias, buenas tardes, buenas noches. I think it's important for us to remember that a lot of these institutions were built for us, by us, and to improve our communities. So a lot of our folks that are going into elected office, especially, are going into institutions that were meant to keep us down. And so acknowledging that and knowing that some of these institutions are for the status quo or for the oppression of our people puts us in a conundrum that our members have no luxury of deciding whether they play defense or offense. So local progress, we don't just have a vision of racial and economic justice. We have a network of over 1,500 local elected officials fighting at the school level, school district level, municipal level, and county level. And they have to respond to the attacks by federal agents with ICE kidnapping people off the streets. But they also have to provide a proactive vision of how to deal with the housing crisis. And so I would argue that the way that we can fight fascism and defend democracy is demonstrating that democracy does work, and that offensive strategy is necessary to do that. And so for us, whether it is having worked with our member in San Francisco to pass the banning of the first rental price fixing software in the country, and then having that followed by Philadelphia, followed by San Diego, and shout out to Berkeley also. We now have over 10 jurisdictions that have protected renters. And those are the kind of things that we need to be doing, while also working with our movement and resource providers around defending against these attacks by federal agents. So it's very important that we do that proactive work, that we show the alternatives, not just talk about, North Stars or other solutions. We actually show and deliver for our people right now. And so whether it is around housing or whether it is around public safety, saying we don't have to rely on police to protect us, we can provide community health responder programs to provide mental health experts to address the issues that we are facing around public safety, where we protect public education and make sure that our institutions like those are strengthened, where families can really participate in our community. And so we really need to be, as Saqib and Richard said, like showing the alternative, showing how democracy can work for people, but also knowing that at the local level, those are the laboratories for offensive strategy. That's where we can actually show it and demonstrate proof of concept that these ideas are not that radical. And actually, the majority of our people want this. And in some instances, you can tie the two things together. For example, giving a shout out to Kendra Brooks in the Philadelphia City Council, who provided the Power Act, which is a package of legislation protecting workers. And in that legislation, there are provisions to protect undocumented workers as well. So we have to do the defensive strategy because we have to stop the harm that is coming from this administration, while also making sure that we are demonstrating and providing examples of what is a positive, proactive vision. And I will close out by saying, like, institutions are not going to save us. It's our people that are going to save us. It's our people in these positions of power and them wielding power effectively that's going to save us. So that way we can protect our people, mitigate the harm of these federal attacks, while offensively moving the needle forward and getting us closer to a society and a world where we can all thrive.
All right, that was, listen, that was good. I don't know how folks are do what they're doing their Tuesday morning, but I'm having a good time. I heard so many things, and one thing, as we bring in our other speakers who are going to join us in this discussion, there's a couple of things that came to mind. I was kind of laughing a little bit. It's not a laughing matter, but the whole conversation of defense and offense, I was like, this is hilarious. This is about the straightest thing, about the most American thing I'll ever admit is that I enjoy college football, and I was watching the playbook. I was watching it happen. And I was like, I was here for it. Somebody call first down whenever ready. Let's go. Christina and Irene, thank you for joining us for the discussion. I'm curious to hear any comments, responses, your answer to the question. One thing that Tony mentioned that's still sitting with me, and I think I'm going to pose it out there, just leave it out there, this contestation of American identity that needs to happen. The right has known that we are very much like, listen, I'm all about the hyphen blank of my identity, but I don't know how I feel about the American identity. And I feel like that's an opportunity that the right took on and created a whole messaging around it. And we're noticing now, with especially the things coming up in the next couple of years, that there's this contestation that needs to maybe happen. But what does it look like? I think it's kind of what we were talking about. But Irene, Christina, I'm curious to hear from you all.
Yeah, thanks for inviting us up. I want to start by just underscoring what a bunch of folks said about, like, the critical importance of defending people, of defending the critical programs that are being snatched away from people, that people really rely on, defending our democracy, defending elections. That's obviously work that has to happen. Otherwise, what we're doing is trying to win strategies that will benefit folks who are no longer here, folks who have opted out, folks who were deported, right? Like, we need to keep our people here and safe as we fight for something more. So I want to start with that. And actually, you know, this notion of defense and offense on a football field, those are different teams of people. And I kind of want to posit a little bit that this is not about everybody trying to do all of it. I actually think we're best served if we have a little more division of labor or division of time that allows sets of people to really focus in on the ever expanding need for defensive work, and a different set of people who are connected, equally connected to one another, who are more focused on the offensive work. But I think the thing for me that I've been sort of batting around in my head, a lot of folks have been referring to this moment by talking about the three earths, three worlds. I can't remember which of them it is. But the Earth One is an Earth that many of our institutions were built for. It's an Earth that, you know, for all of its faults, had a system that we understood, but it actually no longer exists. Earth One is gone. We're currently in Earth Two, and Earth Two is a contestation. And I think of Earth Two actually as sort of a chrysalis. It's actually a place where lots of things are falling apart. And I think in some ways, this is not how we wanted it, but many of us, if we think about it, can celebrate some of what is falling apart that has been hurting us for a long time, but only if we can replace it with something that will benefit us in the future, not something that makes it worse. For my organization, part of our mission is about creating transformation for our folks. And this is, if anything else, it is a transformative moment, which is why it's so critical to do work right now, because a chrysalis is not just about things falling apart. It's also about things being knit together, which means that right now is the opportunity to fight for what comes next. We cannot wait until the attacks are over. We cannot wait until the dust has settled. By then, a new world will have emerged and we will have had nothing to say about it. So, in fact, right now is the most opportune time for us to be thinking about what are the kinds of solutions that we have wanted all along, and to create the organizing groundswell of folks to fight for those things, so that as the dust clears, we actually have built some structures ourselves. We've also hopefully, defended our folks and defeated the worst of what's coming for us. But that we can actually look up at the back end of this and say, wow, maybe none of those things felt possible 5 years ago, but in this particular moment of opportunity, we were actually able to build up something real. And the last thing I will say is that requires a lot of coordination between everyday people on the ground, institutions, elected officials. Like, we actually all need to be on the same page, operating from the same playbook, if we're going to continue on with that metaphor, so that we can, in all of our positionings, move the ball forward.
Yeah, I think to pick up where Christina left off, I think Jose Richard, what you were saying in terms of the playbook, I mean, the very clear contrast is the MAGA and the right have Project 2025. And progressives, Democrats, folks, we don't have an equivalent of that. And so I think that's something for us to keep in mind, which is a lot of organizations and people have different pieces of a plan or a playbook, but we haven't figured out how they look all together and where they intersect and how we could be working together on some of those things. I think also to also pick up on what other folks have mentioned before too, and what I also hear from folks is Christina mentioned that first world, that first Earth that we had is gone. But I also want to say, in that first world, a lot of the policies that we had in place, a lot of the structures that we had in place, a lot of people are making the argument that those were the floor, right? So it was like the basic requirement that we needed to do things like protect abortion, but at the most simple level, and that there's a lot more sophisticated policies that we need, more advanced policies that we need to actually make sure a lot of these policies are accessible and affordable for people. And then the last thing I want to just say too, I think the important thing about not just playing defense is where I think we see a lot of leaders right now is when we're on the defense, we start talking about policies and our values on the opposition's terms. And where I see that being a problem is then we start being able to offer these proactive, these more holistic, these more comprehensive solutions, but we also start using the language and that our opposition uses. And then on top of that, I think too, a lot of folks, they feel and hear that leaders seem like they're a little squishy on our values, or we're all of a sudden making concessions on trans rights or protecting abortion or other policies or issues like that. And so I think going on the offensive is also really important for us as well, because I think as Tony started with, we need to be a lot stronger about how we are identifying and connecting across issues and across how we identify. And a lot of that is through our shared values. And we need to be a lot clearer what those shared values are and be really consistent about what those are, especially as we talk about policies.
Thank you for that. It's funny enough, I love Christina talking about the different Earths, and I was like, yes. And in that process, I think what we're experiencing at the moment is maybe this collective grieving of transitioning from Earth 1 to Earth 2. I was like, Christina is speaking my radical imagination, sci-fi world building language, so we're on the same page. I'm curious, it was funny, I think you mentioned this, Irene, that we don't have a version of Project 2025. And funny enough, I'm not going to say this out there, but I'm going to put it out there. But it feels like this podcast can become a little bit of a laboratory to start building that. I mean, essentially, we're going to be talking throughout the podcast series about different policy solutions. We'll get into the criteria of like what it means, what is a real solution. Actually, that's our next question. But there's an ability for us to start threading together this conversation. And it was someone in the first, and the speakers, I forgot who it was, but talking a little bit about particularly and looking at community or the benefits that come out of these policies to be beyond just to be about racial justice and to also move across racial divides, because that's a conversation that we need to be having. Someone, I think it was Saqib who mentioned about also working with working class white folks. Like, you know, what is needed is like a multicultural class coalition, in my opinion, you know? Well, with that, Irene, thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, all the speakers for that first question. I'm going to take it to our second question. And I mean, I started alluding to some of this, but what are real solutions? What North Star vision of the future do we move us towards? And what values do they need to embody? That's another big question. Good morning, everyone. How are y'all? How are y'all feeling? How are you processing the first question? And, you know, the floor is all yours.
Feeling good. Yeah, feeling very good. Thanks for having me, Eli and Richard. I'm Lucas. I'm from Next City, which is a nonprofit news organization covering all of this amazing work that you all do. I want to point out when you're asking the question, what are real solutions and what is our North Star as this movement for more equitable cities and for a more equitable country? And I want to point out that solidarity is itself a solution that needs more attention right now when we're talking about, as Christina pointed out, that, you know, Earth 1 is gone and we're now on Earth 2 and we're trying to figure out standing up in defense. How we stand up and the defense that happens now will shape Earth 3, as we're putting it. And we need more examples right now of what defense looks like. And it doesn't always come in the shape of protests. We're definitely getting a lot of examples of protest right now, and that's great. But there are other forms of solidarity that are happening that we at Next City as a news organization hear from people who are working between cities to support immigrant communities or to counter the effects of ICE in a city. And there's great fear of retribution right now, and that is well-deserved. It's not unfounded. But at the same time, there's this tension that if we let solidarity examples pass us by, then we're passing by an opportunity for inspiration for someone else to say, oh, that's something I could do in my own city. So I think focusing on solutions is also us saying we need to focus on solidarity right now. And the examples of defense that bring people together, because that bringing people together becomes lasting coalitions, lasting organizations, and the things that bring about this next version of the world, Earth 3, right? So at Next City, we're only focused on solutions. We only do solutions-oriented reporting. We uncover all kinds of interesting things that are happening across the country that people are working on. And we do that because we believe, and Richard will be so happy, I'm going to quote a Beyonce song, which is that where your attention goes, your energy flows. And we need more attention on solutions because, as it was pointed out in that first part, when you take housing, for example, and you say, well, there's no solutions, blame the immigrants, is essentially their argument. It's taking advantage of the fact that we don't have enough focus on solutions. When we know that there are things like community land trusts being built across the country, there's, you know, new support in California for them, a coalition of land trusts in Los Angeles that is growing. There's so many land trusts growing in New York City that they created a map from the New Economy project that we covered at Next City. There used to be none, then there was one, and now there's 19. So the community land trust is the idea that, well, we can, as a community, own the land, reduce the cost of the renting and owning the homes that are on top of it. And then that can create lasting affordability that we can't access now. Or, you know, in talking about defense, there are solutions to housing, and that is from the federal government in the form of the CDFI fund. CDFIs are these banks and community banks across the country that are organized to help fund small businesses, to help you get into a new home, to help you build new affordable housing. And so there are already systems in place that are trying to be dismantled that we're filling that gap on affordable housing. And that's just talking about affordable housing. The overall effect of not talking about solutions is also that these communities end up being talked about only in the context of their problems, like of their worst days or their worst moments. And that can become like a funhouse mirror that the media creates, the media of which we're a part of, creates on these communities, that people don't recognize their neighborhoods anymore. They don't recognize them because they see their neighbors working to create a better place to live. They don't see them filled with, all of the things that are described right now from the White House. And I think that that's a corrosive narrative that then leads to this sort of scapegoating that we're talking about. And the main narrative that at least Next City exists to counter is we're trying to say that change is not only possible, change is happening everywhere. So you can copy it, replicate it, use it for inspiration. And that can be solidarity, that can be land trust, that can be big structures like the CDFI fund. But it is possible, it is happening. And I was just in Kensington. We did our big conference there in Philadelphia, where they're doing community ownership models for real estate. And meanwhile, there's these narratives around Kensington on TikTok of, crime and drugs only. And people are saying, this is where I live. And there are actually people here who are working on solutions. We talked about guaranteed income programs in Philadelphia. And those guaranteed income programs were emulating the very first one that started in Mississippi in the Magnolia Mothers Trust, where they're serving Black moms in Mississippi with regular, no strings attached funds. And I'm reminded of something Aisha Nyandoro said there, where she said, poverty is not a personal failing, it's a policy failing. And that is the overall narrative that I think that we all need to tap into, this North Star, which is to say that we can't blame people for these problems that they're experiencing. We should point the finger at policies, at government, and say there are actually solutions like guaranteed income, because when people realize that solutions exist, it can turn the lights on in the room and see what's really going on and what is also possible. And I'll leave it there. Thanks.
All right, I can take it from there. I'm really excited to be a part of this discussion. As was mentioned at the top, I'm with an alliance called the California Green New Deal Coalition. And as something framed around the Green New Deal, we were really built around a North Star vision for the future that's centered on climate, economic, and racial justice. And, I think we came together during that beautiful Green New Deal moment in 2018 to 2019. And I think while political conditions have changed significantly during that period since then, the need still remains. And I really appreciate this talk of the different Earths that was introduced earlier. And we know that we actually need to save the one Earth that we have. The climate crisis is like a slow-moving freight train, one that continuously exacerbates all other inequities and also has occasional supercharged climate disasters that unfortunately are becoming more and more frequent. We're certainly no stranger to that here in California, where we face the many threats of wildfires, of sea level rise, extreme heat, drought, many more things. And I think we've seen time and time again with the climate crisis that focusing solely on carbon emissions and the long-term threat of climate change is not enough to respond to the everyday material issues that are impacting people. Our coalition came together with that clear-eyed understanding that the same things needed to address climate change could also transform economic inequality, could advance racial justice, and also, yes, as people have been saying, we're ensuring that is inclusive of all working class people, that we're also organizing rural communities, making sure that these are benefiting working class white people. This is about a vision for the future that responds to the conditions that people are experiencing right now. We can move away from fossil fuels that pollute our communities and go to cheaper and cleaner renewable energy sources. We can create a stronger social safety net so that everyone can thrive during that transition. And we can make our communities safer and more resilient and more affordable by making big investments in infrastructure like transit and housing. We were just talking about this, and as we know very well in California and really all over the country, that last part, talking about affordable housing, is really key. We need to make our communities more affordable for everyday people, and housing is almost always the biggest cost. We know we will also eventually need to decarbonize our homes, and to make sure that they're being built in climate safe and healthy places so they're not susceptible to fires or flooding or sited on top of toxic soil. And I think these different crises that are coming together really also opens up the opportunity to organize and bring together a really big tent around a shared agenda for climate and housing justice. This includes things like tenant protections to prevent displacement, funding for whole home upgrades, and promoting green social housing. We were just talking about community land trusts, really pushing for housing as a human right that is publicly or community owned, that is permanently affordable. And I think as we started at the top, at a time in our national politics where we have deep oppression and authoritarianism on the one hand, and I think a lack of strong vision or political leadership on the other, now is the time to turn toward real solutions right from our own communities. We don't need to wait for our so-called leaders to set the direction for us. We are the ones we've been waiting for. So I'm excited to be in this conversation with all of you and looking forward to this series.
Maybe I'll go next. Yeah, great. Well, thank you so much, Eli and Richard. I'm super excited to be part of this important conversation launching the Real Solutions Project. And I just want to share a little bit about the vision and values guiding our work at the National Union of Healthcare Workers. So we all know that our healthcare system is deeply broken. Our costs keep rising, services are being cut all the time, and too many people still can't get the care that they need, even though the US spends more per person on healthcare than any country in the world. And as everyone has already touched on, real solutions must go beyond quick fixes and defense, and they must transform the system to reflect our deepest values: equity, shared prosperity, and human dignity. So at NUHW, we believe one real solution is to replace our corporatized, profit-driven industry with a publicly run, single-payer, comprehensive system, one that guarantees quality, universal care, including mental health care, as a human right for everyone and not just a privilege for the few. Our members, who are nurses, therapists, techs, and service workers, see every day how inequity harms our patients and our communities. Millions remain uninsured or underinsured. The Republican budget has already slashed Medicaid and Affordable Care Act funding, stripping coverage from millions more working families, seniors, and people with disabilities. And then meanwhile, immigrants in our community fear seeking medical care amid reports of ICE agents detaining patients in hospitals. And transgender youth are losing access to gender-affirming care as hospitals cave to political pressure from the Trump administration. So these are not isolated problems, and they're the result of a system that puts profits and politics ahead of patients. Through our fights for healthcare justice, NUHW has proven that change is possible when patients and workers stand together. We've helped pass stronger behavioral health laws in California, and we're holding corporate giants like Kaiser, Sutter, and Providence accountable to the needs of patients and caregivers. And together with allies across the state, including many in this conversation today, we're advancing a single payer campaign in California, certainly a challenging effort, but a transformative one that we're fully committed to achieving. Just in terms of values, real solutions have to be grounded in our shared values. Equity means everyone, rich or poor, urban or rural, deserve the same high quality care, including immigrants, people of color, and transgender community members, with no exceptions. Democracy means healthcare policy should be shaped by working people and affected communities, not corporate lobbyists and insurance executives. And solidarity means recognizing that our health is bound together. None of us are well unless all of us are cared for. So a single payer system would bring those values to life, cutting waste and corporate profit and reinvesting billions into care and guaranteeing that mental health, reproductive, and gender affirming services are fully covered for all. So just in closing, I just wanted to say, if we truly want shared prosperity and justice, we must transform the systems that keep people sick, divided, and excluded. And for NUHW, that's the real solution and the North Star we're working towards. It's really the future we know we can build together. Thanks.
Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are. My name is Sara Hudson. I'm from Nonprofit Quarterly, which is a nonprofit narrative platform dedicated to the advancing conversation and practice in nonprofits, philanthropy, and movements. And for those of you who are not watching on YouTube, I'm recovering from an illness. And so I'm going to ask for everyone's grace because I may have to pause as I'm speaking. But when I was thinking about this weekend, I really wanted to bring that perspective of narrative power building and what it means for real solutions to involve and really center narratives. At NPQ, we're journalists, but really we're storytellers. We're frontline workers, organizers, leaders, emerging leaders who are thinking every day about the words that we use and the stories that we tell and how that shapes what people believe is possible. One of the things that I think is a real challenge right now for our stories is that we're often trapped in narratives that only know what's broken, not what we're building towards. And real solutions are as much about narrative power as policy power. So as I prepared for today's conversation, I went back to a column that we relaunched this year called We Stood Up. And it's a place for frontline organizers and activists. You don't have to have any writing experience, but to tell first-person stories of solidarity and small wins. We relaunched We Stood Up this year because our readers kept coming back to us and saying, we need hope. We want to hear stories of wins. We want to see some of the places that we want to have joy. We want to see ways that we are building community and solidarity. It has me thinking about when media only reports on problems, it's too easy for communities to become defined by deficits instead of organizing power. It's easy for people to become, quote unquote, the homeless or the vulnerable or the underserved rather than neighbors or workers or organizers who are all fighting for something better. That warped storytelling serves the status quo and it makes injustice feel inevitable rather than institutionally designed. And it also exhausts us instead of animating us. I will say, I looked this weekend and we saw this in action with the No Kings protests on October 18th. A major media outlet reported that thousands of people, quote unquote, protested when in fact nearly 7 million people attended protests across the country. Editorial choices, narrative, the words that we use, those are not neutral. And in this case, it minimized the scale of mass mobilization and told readers that resistance is marginal instead of widespread. So when I think about real solutions, they flip this script. They give us a vision to report from, not just crises to report on. So for example, when we cover baby bonds, we're not just writing about wealth inequality, we're showing how we're actively building a world in which every child has the foundation to thrive. When we cover community crisis response programs, we're documenting what public safety looks like when it's rooted in care, not criminalization. And that starts with language. When a media outlet writes, an elected official's statement was incorrect, for example, quote unquote, instead of an elected official lied to people today, we're obscuring accountability. We're protecting power instead of naming it. So the challenge I see for storytellers, and we are all storytellers at the end of the day, as we think about real solutions, how are we covering policy in ways that help people see themselves in a shared we? How do we show this? What are the stories we're telling that show how deeply connected our fates are? How the immigrant family, the renter, the worker, the parent all need the same transformed systems. For me, real solutions journalism and storytelling means being as rigorous about documenting what's working as exposing what's broken. And so I think when I think of real solutions, I think we need bold storytelling to match bold policy. At NPQ, we see our role not just as documenting as the world as it is, but the world as it's being built by organizers, frontline workers, activists, philanthropy folks, nonprofit folks, families, because when people can see belonging and broadly shared prosperity in action, I think that's when it stops feeling impossible and it starts feeling inevitable. And we're ready for it to start feeling inevitable.
That's amazing.
Oh, we can't hear you. Oh,
Oh no. But Eli, I can jump in if it's cool.
go ahead, Ivan. Yeah.
Okay. Well, Sarah, you literally we're talking about narrative and empower that we have around communication. So thank you so much for uplifting that. I really want to hearing from all these amazing speakers, I think it's also important to ask ourselves as we think about real solutions and North Stars are we actually meeting the needs of people? Are we meeting the needs that we're hearing from community itself? And I say that because sometimes in the appearance of not shared values, of us not being in agreement with other folks, we need to ground ourselves in shared needs. We need to know what people actually are asking for, and that will help us to meet this moment and really bridge those divides that we actually probably don't really have. And so, as a network, a national network with local elected officials, we have learned that it's not a one size fits all solution that's going to fix this problem. We need to go into rural communities, suburbs, and cities and know how to better adapt to meet the needs of those folks in those communities. And a lot of times, a lot of those needs are shared, but the how it happens needs to be different. And so I think one thing that Sara touched on that I loved is the messaging. It's disseminating a 30-page report to a bunch of people is not going to be effective. We really need to make sure, as the kids say, touch grass and talk to people how they will listen. So using social media, using local press, making sure we're not allowing for a void to be filled by misinformation, but allow our effective leaders, our own people, to fill that void and communicate directly to people the way that they can understand, but also break down what these policies do to improve their lives. And we also know a lot of these policies, whether they be public safety, whether they be housing, whether they be economic justice, all intersect. And it's no surprise that the most vulnerable people being targeted right now are immigrants and the trans community because they're easy targets. And what we need to get to is the actual source of the problems. And so a lot of our folks, whether it be around public safety or whether it be whatever the issue area, are addressing those folks directly. And our members who are school board members defending public education or county officials that are protecting access to health care, it's really important that we don't just say we're defending you. We say break it down and break down what this piece of legislation does, break down what this program does. But I think the communications is a key component to explain how we can get to our North Star, but also explain how we are actually meeting the needs of people right now.
I would love to hop in on that. As you were speaking, you made me realize a connection that I hadn't thought about, but that both storytelling and solutions, it's very easy and very dangerous to think about it as one way. We're bringing you a story, we're bringing you a solution versus we're asking, to your point, we're going to people and saying, what are the problems that you're trying to solve? What's hard? Whose voices are we listening to? What stories are we telling? Whose stories are we silencing? And what stories do people need to hear rather than assuming that we know the solution, assuming that we know the stories that people need to hear. And it makes me think about, I used to work in government, local government, post-Katrina New Orleans, and in the federal government, in the Civil Rights Department in division. And that was one of the most important things, was going into communities, touching grass, as you'd say, but actually saying, like, we're not coming with a prepackaged idea of what is needed. We're coming to listen. And the first part of storytelling and solutions actually is not stating facts, it's asking questions.
Thanks so much, everyone. This conversation is really resonating with the work that we do at Climate Community Institute. We are a climate and economy think tank that was also born out of the Green New Deal movement, And we work now with movements and progressive policymakers, as folks were saying, kind of like going to the source of the problem and asking them, what do you need to make your case? What do we need to sort of both improve life at the basic material benefit level, but also kind of transform the economy? And one way that we do this is that we create research that puts forward, we work with movements to create research that puts forward real solutions that accomplishes a few things that kind of thread together a lot of the things that people have said already on this call and in this discussion. First of all, it tries to make connections between the different crises, the climate and economic crises that working class people are going through. It also calls out the bad actors that are standing in the way of shared prosperity and a livable planet. And it also envisions a stronger state that can both regulate and improve the economy while also decarbonizing it. So first of all, linking climate politics to everyday economic issues aims to cohere a multiracial cross-class movement around a shared vision of prosperity in a warming world. So our belief is that if climate policies aren't taking on what particularly working class people's material realities look like on the ground, the progress we make just won't last. It won't last politically, it won't last institutionally, it won't last materially. Data for Progress did polling recently before the last election and found that cost of living and the economy ranked far above most all other issues, and that climate was sort of at the bottom of people's concerns. But as we know, climate is an ultimate destabilizer of economic concerns and an economic threat multiplier. So there's already a deep connection between these two things. And we believe that in our research that focuses on sort of policy shift, it has to have a narrative change component that does a better job of connecting them. We also work hard in this research to call out the villains. So, Trump's coalition created an unholy alliance between very disparate political and class groups that argued that institutional politicians and the institutions themselves, like the EPA, were the problem. And if we were just able to sweep them out of the way, then the working class could be billionaires as well. Now we know the flaws in this story, and we try in this research to redirect anti-institutionalist sentiment at the very billionaires and private companies who have broken our institutions, who have fueled the climate crisis, and who've deepened economic divides in this country. This is more than just kind of the regular story about fossil fuels, though they're still important, obviously, in this narrative. It's also landlords, tech oligarchs, and bosses as well. So we try to focus on naming the forces that are actively harming working people and slowing the climate transition. And we see this as a key way to kind of foment and foster that solidarity that we're talking about, to give people a different story about who's responsible for why their life is harder and more expensive and more dangerous. But as many people have said, just as important as naming the villains to focus on where the problem lies, we also need, as this call is themed, a positive vision of what solutions look like. So we need people, and we try to make this clear in our research, we need people to imagine what it feels like to live in a better world where they're not straining under debt or unaffordable bills, or getting sick, or unable to afford their home insurance. Instead, we want research that envisions a neighborhood where green spaces, beautiful green schools, and affordable, healthy food are in abundance. And in contrast to sort of popular right-wing, visions of populism in gutting parts of the state, we believe that the state is integral to delivering these real solutions. And so remaking the state into a strong and capable actor will allow us to deliver on lower costs, stable prices, better wages, and a livable climate. So such a role means not only investing in public and social infrastructure, but also creating strong enough sticks and regulatory regimes so that corporations have strong guardrails to ensure shared prosperity. And so we see a lot of our research as sort of connecting this very kind of lived experience material reality from movements to what it would look like for society to sort of not only just be able to deliver on those benefits, but be strong enough to continue to govern in the name of that public good.
Thank you, Rithika. Thank you, everyone. This is so rich. I hope y'all had your espresso this morning. It's a lot. I'm gonna listen to it at least another time. And we're gonna turn now to a question around how do we organize differently? Where do we go from here? What does it look like to advance real solutions in this moment? And who is the we? Right? We often use this we, but let's talk about expanding the we. Let's talk about what that looks like in this moment. Christina, will you kick us off?
Absolutely. First, I just want to clear up, I don't want to take credit for the 3 Earths piece. I actually heard that at a Democracy Alliance plenary where Ai-jen Poo, who's the founder and president of the National Domestic Workers Alliance, was speaking. So that's where I got that from. I think the first thing I want to say is that before I talk about shifts that need to be made in organizing, I want to speak a bit to what is the state of organizing. Post-election, organizing got, I think, a really bad rap. A lot of folks were blaming organizing for the results of the presidential election, which I think is an entirely unreasonable place to place blame. We are, of course, a part of an ecosystem. And the reality, as we were speaking to before, is that our government, our country, the American values of rugged individualism and, pulling yourself up by your bootstraps and meritocracy, that whatever you have, that's what you deserve, that's what you've earned. Those things in combination with a Democratic Party that I think is overrun by corporate Dems, a Republican Party that's obsessed with shrinking government, those things paved the way for a billionaire to get into office and bring his billionaire friends along and move a billionaire's first agenda. So I don't blame organizing by itself for us getting to where we are. But I will admit that there are, some shifts that have been made in organizing for the good and others that really don't set us up to meet this moment. I think over time, organizing got more specialized by issue or by identity or by a really narrow definition of civic engagement. And there's lots of reasons why that happened. Some are important reasons why that happened. Others are funding related reasons, et cetera. But it does mean that it's hard for us to see the full picture and organize people around the full picture if we spend a lot of time building a muscle being super specialized. I also think that the COVID effect of organizing really weakened our muscle to engage with people face to face, to touch grass. And it weakened our ability to build tolerance and participate in principled struggle in a way that can help us move forward despite some differences that we have. And then the final the piece is that, as both Irene and Sara were alluding to, there was a lot of reverse organizing that was happening, policy-driven organizing where you go out and find a base of people that you can convince around a policy as opposed to starting with people and understanding the policies that would make work for them. Those things in particular, I think, make organizing in this moment less well-suited to really meet the need that we have. I think the very first real solution is real organizing. And by that, I mean going out and directly speaking to people who are directly impacted by what's happening right now. And there are lots of different versions of that we. There are people who are under attack by the government, either through the ICE raids or the Medi-Cal cuts or, their trans identities, et cetera. There are lots of groups of people who are impacted in that way. There are also people who are impacted who deeply just believe in democracy and are appalled at what they're seeing. That's a group of impacted people. You've got to start with people who are impacted and then do the work to help build a shared analysis, to politicize them, to help them think together about community solutions, to help them connect to one another, and then move together in strategic campaigns to win for themselves, for their communities, et cetera. So that's the first real solution. And I think it's important to say that doing that is what helps create the groundswell of outside pressure that makes policies that right now do not seem politically possible much more feasible. I think beyond that, I will say, so I am an old school ACORN organizer, and there were some pieces of organizing that have been a little lost in the sort of ACORN history that I think would be useful to bring back. Actually, I was on a Netroots panel talking about some of the lessons of ACORN that could be applied to this moment. And one of them was that ACORN was multi-issue, multi-race, multi-gender, etc. It was there for all of its whatever faults there were. ACORN was able to put people together who were pretty different in their thinking, ideologically, etc., but who could move together, who could, be in struggle together because of a shared analysis around class. It was missing the race piece. But that's a muscle that we've lost a little. And so getting back to this sort of broad-based organizing across race, across issue, really, I think would benefit organizing. I would say that there are some experiments right now that are happening, particularly around mass-based organizing and distributive organizing, that are really important for this moment. Giving people tools to become their own organizers, not depending on the paid organizing staff to do all of the work that's necessary, is going to be critical. Really unlocking the potential of individual people that are out in community, that are ready to get to work, but don't have, the infrastructure, that they don't have the tools, they don't have the training. Figuring out how to find those people, support those people, resource those people, and let them do what they do best in their communities is going to be really important. And I think the last thing I will say is that the solutions that we're looking for are really not just related to the current attacks. A lot of folks have been talking about this, but we really need to be thinking about some of what was happening before that is still undergirding what's happening now, some of the cost of living issues, some of the corporate power issues. So as we're thinking about, who are the sets of people who are impacted, we have to remember not just to organize the people that are in the most visible pain, but also the people that have been sort of enduring a long-lasting pain that in this particular moment are more ready to rise up than they have been before. So just as a little, I know that some of you will be listening to the rest of the podcast episodes, but I will be on an episode talking about progressive revenue. We'll talk more about the connections between the organizing and the policy solution. So tune in for that.
Thanks so much, Christina. That really resonates here as well. We aren't a base building organization. We're obviously a research institution. But as I said before, a lot of the movements that we work with are sort of beginning from this point of beginning with feelings, right? You mentioned being appalled, pain, anguish. I think it's clear that we need to capture the sort of justifiable rage or address the fundamental anguish that Americans feel against their unfair social and economic conditions. But progressive movements have to find a way to direct that rage at the billionaires and politicians and institutions that have worked to concentrate wealth rather than vulnerable scapegoats, and the public institutions that ought to serve the public interest. I think that cohering this new alignment requires putting forward compelling campaigns that both directly take on wealth inequality and a heating planet while offering hope, right? And that's what this entire kind of kickoff episode and series is about real solutions that can offer a vision of change. We think that campaigns like this and programs like this should be green. They should be focused on issues that can, make sure that we have a future life on this planet by bending emissions curves and adapting to the climate crisis. That they should be economic. So they should focus on the sort of like fundamental pain of the cost of living crisis, but also take on broader questions of how the economy works and put power back in people's hands who actually make the economy run. And they should also be populist. They should focus on confronting concentrated power and connecting to a more distributive democratic version of what life could look like. And so at CCI, we kind of orient our policy research around the strategy, what we call green economic populism, which is a framework that we've designed to address, to kind of like orient and ground our research to address the overlapping crises of economic insecurity, climate disaster, and political inaction and disengagement. And so I think recohering this new we, the primary goals are to give people back control over who the economy works for and how the climate crisis is managed, right? Overall, we see a vision of a new we that is sort of built from a from a new mixed green economy of gay people who see themselves, see and feel real material benefits delivered, but also see a future in which they can actually hold and wield power over the economy. And so we believe that in this moment, the key to rebuilding a resilient, multiracial, multi-class political movement with strong momentum is to deliver on these real material benefits for working class people and linking them to policies that both advance the public good, accomplish decarbonization, and initiate stronger economic policies. And so our research is really geared at making it clear that there are real actionable policy solutions that can make this a reality. Advancing a political platform like green economic populism in the United States, we think has the potential to rally a disenchanted working class base and destabilize right-wing movements. An article published in Jacobin earlier this summer showed that working class voters actually overwhelmingly support a range of bold progressive economic policies, from raising the minimum wage to protecting Social Security. There's wide approval of a range of progressive economic policies that both build a stronger state and redistribute wealth away from the top 1%. So this story that working class voters are more conservative or that they don't, want things to get better for everyone, it's actually just like a cultural myth that we sort of want to attack and address at that fundamental level to recohere and actually engage political base. And we know that conditions over the next 4 years will continue to worsen for everyday people. And rebuilding amidst that chaos requires progressives to bring together a political coalition that can both rack up electoral wins and change the political landscape and be prepared with a governing agenda in hand for when the time comes. I just want to preview really quickly, which you'll hear later on this podcast, about our home insurance work, which is kind of focused on building that political momentum via immediate relief to win larger material wins. It's a good example of the chance to organize around an escalating material crisis, building state programs in the absence of federal assistance, and calling out villains. So in 2 recent briefs, we try to accomplish this task. We explain in the first how state-enabled insurance programs, or insurers of last resort, are actually almost 86% of them across the country are governed by private insurance executives. And so already insufficient stopgap programs are being thrown into chaos as private insurance companies refuse to cover people. And then we also offer the case for housing resilience agencies, which are state-run entities that would offer people affordable insurance and do comprehensive disaster risk mitigation. So we know that rebuilding the base is no small task, but we are in a moment where clear, targeted, visionary policies can accomplish multiple things that both rally the strong base and build back a strong, powerful state that can deliver these benefits and govern for the public good.
And I also want to add too, because I think lifting up something that a couple of folks have also said. I think we just also need to question. I think organizing actually is working, right? So we did just see over 7 million people turn out for the No Kings rally, right? So that was just a one-day thing that's connected to a larger organizing body, a larger vision for what we're doing. But it is working. So I think, like Christina was saying, we also can't let election results be the only thing we look at as to whether or not what we're doing is working, or let that be what dictates what this means for the whole country. Because we also know that there has been organizing that has continued that was before this election and after, and we are seeing progress at local and state levels because of this organizing. That work is still going on. The other thing I want to mention too is I also feel like it's also important for us to reflect on part of the reason why we're also seeing a lot of what's happening on the right-wing side is this is also a reaction to the progress that we had from the progressive side, from the left-wing side. So we were actually seeing a lot of progress on trans rights, on abortion, on women's rights, on public safety. We were seeing some real solutions. So we were starting to experiment with places with eliminating cash bail. We were looking at places that were starting to eliminate gender categories in the ways that they ran some of their programs, right? So we were actually seeing progress, and we still see some of that progress. And so this is both a reminder that organizing has continued. We have decades of organizing that we've built on that is still making progress. But also just a reminder that in some ways, I hate to say it, is where we're at right now is also an indication of how far we've been able to push on our side. And then the last thing I want to mention too, which is I think that MAGA and right wing have really captured, and I think folks have mentioned already in this conversation, is that they've really focused on culture, building what a MAGA culture looks like, what it sounds like, what they say, how they dress, what they talk about, how they talk about those sorts of things. And a lot of that culture is built on misinformation as well, which is a really important thing to keep in mind. And I think one of the things we also need to think about too, that I think we are also really good from the more progressive community-based side, is we also are very good about having a specific culture or bringing culture into our organizing too. And when I talk about culture, I mean both in terms of the diversity and the backgrounds and experiences that we have, but also the specific flavors of our different communities and what brings us together. And seeing how that has been really effective in sort of pushing back against this right-wing agenda, I think is really important. But I also think an important part of culture is also just having more humor and more fun to what we do, right? Because I think what I keep hearing from young folks is what is so attractive about what's happening on the opposite side, on the right-wing side, is they offer a sense of fun, a sense of inclusion, and a sense of belonging. And that's something that I think we can do more and be stronger about on our side as well. And I'd love to hear other folks' thoughts on that too, because I know, especially from folks at Othering and Belonging, you guys are really building that kind of momentum, building that container for organizations and our movement to really think about as well.
Yes, let's have some fun. This is so helpful. I just want to lift up a couple threads here. Several of you have talked about the shared values that we're building on, that this moment solidarity is so key, that coming together right now to be in solidarity with people who are under attack is also building the relationships and expressing the values that will be the foundation for the future world. And that kind of gets me back to the chrysalis metaphor, that we're knitting things together that will build the future that we want, and that there are these local proofs of what's possible that are giving us hope. And so telling those stories is also part of building those relationships around our shared values and that sense of hope, and also just that vision for what's emerging and what we're trying to move towards. So I just wanted to lift up those pieces. And then I think, Saqib, you had some thoughts on this question. Pass it to you.
Yeah, thanks, Eli. It was great to hear the panelists talk about this. I think one of the things that comes to my mind is that in so much of our organizing, we're conditioned to think that the levers of power are in government, and that we need to actually, rally at the state house, rally at city council, go to your members of Congress, lobby, because the idea that if we convince them to do the right thing, it will happen. And I think what we've seen, I think known this for a long time, but certainly after the Citizens United decision, corporations run our government. And I think our organizing really hasn't adapted to that reality, at least not sufficiently, right? I think there's some organizations like ACE do a great job at actually figuring out how we're making sure that we're targeting corporations front and center. But I do think that that's a thing that's really important in this moment, especially as we see, as we descend into fascism in a moment where government's not responsive to people, government's very clearly beholden to a handful of billionaire oligarchs. We need to figure out how we're taking those folks on directly. And that's not only, frankly, it's not only a good power analysis, it's also good morale building for our base, right? Because people know that if you keep going to elected officials and nothing changes, you keep trying to mobilize for elections and nothing changes, or at least the big things don't change, that gets deflating. And so it can be really, really uplifting to actually have a clear sense of who are the corporations that are actually upholding the problems and directly creating a crisis for them. As one of my mentors always says, like, they're out there creating a crisis in our communities. We need to create a crisis for them. And I think that that's a thing that if we want to be able to figure out how we can start, start talking about the real solutions, we'll have to really name who's standing in the way and expose them and then take them on.
Can I jump in here?
Please.
Or is there a stack?
I think actually Lucas was next, and then you, Tony. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I'm looking forward to what Tony has to say based on all he said earlier. But I mean, I want to agree strongly with what Irene said about how progress is not really lost. It's local, and there is progress being made. And if we're thinking about how we have to organize differently, Next City really works for people who are working in government, they're working in nonprofits, and they're working in all these different sectors. And historically, people have gone to like their own insular conferences. There's one just for transportation. There's one just for pick your topic. And now more than ever, as we say all the time, now more than ever, it's important to work across all of these sectors, because I think it was Ivan was pointing out that all the policies intersect. And there's nothing clearer than when you think about it in terms of climate, like Rithika's talking about, where you can't solve climate resilience or reverse the effects by just doing it in housing, but you can contribute in housing. And the same thing with poverty. You're not going to solve poverty just by talking about economic mobility programs. You do have to talk with folks in transportation and in economic development and in pick your thing. So it's important that the people who are working in these spaces work with each other across the traditional sort of silos that we've been in. And to get to the point that was just being made about like feeling that the conditions of power all rest in government, I did see some of that in our own sources in when people are trying to defend against attacks on their programs. They try to rally their members to reach out to conservative leaders or powerful allies in the big banks, which these people aren't really your allies. They never really were, right? So it can't be that we're afraid of our own power. The power that was really developed and cultivated amongst groups on this call and groups across the country who we cover is the community power. And I think that we saw even early on in the reaction to new administration's attacks, people begging to be asked to do something, right? So we can't shy away from asking people to do things and being overt about it. So yeah, I'd say just who are our real allies? We need to be thinking about that. I used to work in LGBT media, and there was a lot of, celebrating that all these corporations had decided to join pride parades or advertising in LGBT media or whatever it might be. Those corporations aren't around right now. They've pulled back. Their advertising's gone, right? They're not in the parades anymore. These folks were never really the allies. These weren't the real power that was built. They might be the result of pressures that were created or cultural shifts that happened. But that pressure and cultural shift came from community and people. And that's really where attention has to be.
Thanks, Lucas. I can go next. I have a few thoughts, and let's see if they hang together here. So going back, Irene, to something you said about culture, I think that's really important. This relationship between culture and organizing. I remember going back 20 years having conversations in organizing circles about the need to organize around culture, and I think we still struggle with that. But one of the ways I think about that is that we need to be better about going to where people already are, and not as focused on trying to create spaces and trying to bring people in, because some people will come in, but most people won't. People decide where they want to go. That's often very cultural, and those are places we should look to be present as well. Kind of related to this, on this question of organizing, I know I've been guilty of this, but I think we often use organizing and base building interchangeably, and they're not the same. Base building is one type of organizing, but it's not the only kind. It is the kind that certainly us I think probably a lot of us here have spent most, if not all of our time doing. And I think we're in a moment where other kinds of organizing need to happen again around culture, which may take us out of the base building mode specifically. So I think there's one, we need to be doing evaluating of how well our base building is actually going, right? So there is that question, or is our base building working? But beyond that, I think we need to think about what it looks like to do organizing beyond base building, right? To be part of a bigger national conversation. Because those conversations are coming to us. I think probably a lot of people, certainly that I've spoken to, and maybe on the call as well, we've seen people in our communities, in our neighborhoods, in our friends and families drifting right. They are being organized, and not through base building, but through other kinds of cultural organizing. And that's something that I think we've seen a lot of, and that we need to contend with. And I was thinking, when recently Bernie Sanders went to West Virginia, right, and spoke and packed the house there, and he was organized. He wasn't base building, but he was organizing. That to me is an interesting example. We think about what is our version of doing that, right, at a more grassroots local level, of doing that kind of organizing that isn't base building in places where we're bringing the fight, we're bringing the message or the real solutions into terrain that is not our comfort terrain, that is not our traditional terrain. What does that look like? I remember back in 2016, there was this moment around this cultural piece and this piece about going to new places where Elizabeth Warren decided not to go to Joe Rogan and Bernie Sanders did. And that was the first moment I was aware of that being a choice, and was aware of there being a need to go to these places where we might not normally go. And again, jumping forward to now, what does it look like for us to make those kinds of organizing decisions that are not base building? They're hopefully linked to the base building, but they are different. What does it look like at the organizational level, at the political level for the social movement left, to begin to do that work and do it in a more intentional, organized, and consistent way?
Thank you, Tony. Go ahead, Richard.
Can y'all hear me now? Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Listen, so many thoughts. I feel I love particularly in organizing. I mean, I've been an organizer since I was 15. And thank you, Tony, for that differentiation between organizing and base building. And there's this element that is missing. I'm like, take me back to the early 2090s organizing. Christina, when you talked about we have to be multi-issue, we have to be multi-framework. I mean, that's what the bus riders union taught me here in Los Angeles. At the end of the day, we were all bus riders. So you had to be multi-issue and multi-framework. So thank you all so much. You can't hear the background noises, can you? Oh, welcome. I am in downtown Los Angeles. But no, thank you all so much. Again, it's been such a dope conversation and such a hope. I really am thinking, I'm gonna talk to the rest of the team about this, but can this be the Real Solutions podcast, become this version of a Project 2025, or the thinking behind this multi-issue, multi-policy agenda, organizing framework, cultural strategy? So thank you all. I don't know, Eli, any reflections before we close out?
I guess I just wanted to try to kind of recap a little bit the different conversations we had. So we started out talking about why work on real solutions, why focus on real solutions. And we were talking about this period really being a transitional period, about lots of assumptions being upended, about people's needs being already really severe even before this crisis hit. And to be honest with people about what's needed and what would really work. And that we're in this kind of chrysalis where things are coming apart and we're knitting new things together. And then we got into, well, what would be a real solution? What counts? And we were talking about shared values of human dignity, equity, health. And then we were also talking about shared needs, what are the actual needs? Because we don't always connect on values or frameworks, but what are the actual needs and how do the solutions respond to them? And then impacts, what would the solution actually deliver for all people and bring the well-being, the belonging, the the needs that people are expressing. And then we got into like, well, how do we do this? How do we organize? And we're talking about building across differences, about organizing itself being a solution, and really like the foundation for all of it, about building cultural power and meeting folks where they're at with the symbols and identities and connections that they already have. So I know I glossed over a ton of things. I'm sorry for that, but I wanted to just try and do a little bit of recap so we can create a container for this. And then the last thing we wanted to do is to just give you a little bit of a preview of the episodes of the podcast series that are coming up.
Yeah, so again, everyone, thank you for joining us to this first podcast episode, which will drop next Monday, and then we'll move forward with every 2 weeks after that. And so we heard a lot about the framing and the grounding around real solutions, and you may be wondering, well, what are these policies that we're going to be talking about? And the first one is going to be baby bonds. Baby bonds are publicly funded trust accounts created when a baby is born, particularly those from low-wealth families. When that baby becomes an adult, they can use the fund for purposes such as education, home ownership, or entrepreneurship. Baby bonds help ensure that all families have a nest egg that can be used for investing in what's needed for a good life. In that episode, you'll hear me talk about we also need millennial bonds. And so what's after that, Eli?
Then the second episode is going to focus on community crisis response programs, which are being set up actually all over the country. Over 100 different communities have set them up as an alternative response system where you can call 911 and have somebody who's a community health worker or a respected peer in your neighborhood, non-law enforcement, come and respond in an appropriate way to all kinds of different crises. So we'll hear about that in the second episode.
And then we're still not done. Some of our panelists have started sort of dropping in their little previews for their episodes. Then the Real Solutions episodes will focus on wealth taxes and how they could generate revenue for much needed public projects and programs, and social housing as a real solution to address the escalating housing affordability crises, and an episode on disasters and community resilience. Then we start finishing this round of solutions with public finance of elections, which provides supports to candidates to run for office, even if they're not favored by wealthy political interest. Finally, we'll reconvene similar to this for a live stream roundtable discussion to draw connections between the different policy proposals and strategies for moving forward real solutions.
So please join us for those conversations, listen into the podcast, reach out to us, and look out for the announcement of that event, the next live stream event where we'll continue this conversation. And real problems deserve real solutions. So let's do this work together. And thank you so much for all our speakers today. Such amazing leadership. It gives me such hope. And so much insight that y'all shared. So thank you for your time.